The Torah reading this week, for those of us outside the land of Israel, is the Parsha of Nasso. And Nasso is famous for many reasons. It's a very long Parsha, it has 176 verses. Although for those people tasked with reading the Torah, they shouldn't worry because the last section is very, very repetitive. The problem that this Parsha presents to us, and just to quote the precise words of Rabbi Jonathan Saxon looking at the Parsha, is it seems to be a heterogeneous collection of utterly unrelated items. So what we're going to seek to do tonight is we're going to connect the dots. We're going to look at the contents, the major contents of this week's Torah reading, and we'll derive, hopefully, a cogent theme and some important takeaways for us to take with us. So let's look at the Parsha itself. The Parsha of Nasso, we're going to look at 5 components of the Parsha. In the beginning of this week's Torah reading, we get the instructions for the families of the Levites in terms of their duties and responsibilities in the Mishkan. And I'm not going to share the screen again, but we have this picture in our mind of the camp of the Jewish people with the Mishkan, with God's address right at the center, surrounded, that's the inner circle. The next concentric circle is at the entranceway, Aaron and Moshe and their families live. And then on the other 3 sides of the Mishkan are the 3 Levite families, Gershon, Kehath, and Merari. And then the third concentric circle, which makes up the Machane Yisrael, the camp of the Jewish people, consists of 3 tribes on each of the 4 sides. All 12 tribes are present, counting the 2 sons of Yosef as individual tribes. So we have a complete picture of the Jewish people. We're talking about movement again. So therefore, each of the 3 families of Shevet Levi, not Aaron's descendants who are Kohanim, but the other 3 families, they have a task to do, and each one's assigned their task in a hierarchical order. Kehath has the most sublime task of moving the ark and the most holy items. Kehath removes the walls and the poles and the outer things, and Merari takes care of the rest. So there's a hierarchical organization for these 3 divisions of the tribe of Levi, each having a clear task to do, and each accepting upon themselves the task of doing their job as the Jewish people move from one place to another in terms of disassembling and assembling the Mishkan, the sanctuary of God. The next item we come across is the Sota, the story of the wayward wife. Not a story, it's a prescription that the Torah has, so that when there comes a sense of jealousy and concern and suspicion on the part of the husband, there's a procedure of bringing her into the inner sanctuary of the camp. Then a portion is written which contains the name of God. That portion is dissolved into the water. The wife, under suspicion, drinks that water, and if she's in fact guilty of infidelity and of violating her marriage, then she and the person with whom she violated her marital bonds die in a strange way. And if not, then it becomes obvious and clear that this suspicion was unfounded, and she can resume her life with her husband. Unusual, famous part of the Torah. Next comes the Nazir. Nazir is also a unique aspect of Judaism, because we know we have a concept of not adding on to the Torah, that we have a Torah that's perfect and complete. But the Torah itself has a voluntary segment in it where a Nazir can trigger through his speech. He can declare himself, and a woman can declare herself a Nazir. And then certain restrictions, added restrictions, not drinking wine, not cutting hair, become absolutely biblical level prohibitions upon the person. and they may not violate that vow, and typically it runs for 30 days and it comes to an end. The next is the famous words of the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. And we know it's 3 stanzas, three sections. God should bless you and keep you and protect you. God's face should shine upon you. God should elevate you and convey to you peace. And as noted by Rabbi Sachs, it's the oldest blessing in the world. And we observe it in the synagogue. In Israel, it's every single day. The Kohanim come up, they take their shoes off, they turn around to face the people, and they utter these words of blessing in the name of God. And for us outside of the land of Israel, it's only on the festival days that we do this, because we reach a requisite level of joy. And the Kohanim's job as leaders of the Jewish people is to bring down and convey God's blessing to the Jewish people. And then the final section, which is very lengthy and full of repetition, brings us back to the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, of this 4th book of the Torah, which is the first day of the Nisan, the month of Nisan, a year after the Exodus, just short of a year after the Exodus, when we dedicated the Mishkan itself. And it detailed each of the 12 Nesiim, the 12 princes of the Jewish people, brought a special offering. They happened to have each been the same day after day for the first 12 months of the month. Each tribe on its own day came forward, represented by its Nasi, by its prince, and presented a whole group of items and valuables that were presented for use in the Mishkan. So here's our 5 components of the Torah reading, seeming unrelated. So now we're going to try to weave together, first and foremost, a common dimension to them. And then in the end, we're going to try to understand how we can really enrich our lives on a daily basis by taking away the right lessons to each of these components. And we'll use as our lever the dramatic conclusion to the Birkat Kohanim. Okay, so when the Kohanim stand before the Jewish people and they convey God's blessings to the Jewish people, the concluding word is V'yosem l'cha shalom. There should be peace. We know peace is a central part of prayer. Sim shalom, we conclude our prayers with that. We sing it together. God should allow there to be peace. We refer to the fact that there's peace in the heavens, there's harmony, and therefore that same sense of harmony should invade and be brought down from on high and become the defining element of our own lives. Mistakenly, we oftentimes take the word shalom, peace, harmony, on a very superficial level. There's no drone shooting at my house. I don't hear this. There's not another nation. We're not under attack. We're not in the midst of strife. I'm not standing behind a sandbag looking out over the horizon to see whether I'm safe or not. That's not a proper view of the notion of shalom, of peace. And significantly, we're going to begin unraveling and connecting this parsha with the understanding of the idea that shalom is a name of God, and it has to do with the word shleimut, to be complete, to be whole, to be in harmony, to be in sync. And we're going to develop each dimension of this idea. But I want to start with a simple idea of an oil can. I not long ago took a group of children to visit in a faraway place a electrical generation station. It was built almost 100 years ago, very primitive. It was built on a river, and it was utilizing the current, and it was able to generate electricity. And then sitting there very prominently was an oil can. And they explained that there was a full-time person. As a matter of fact, there were 24 hours, 2 12-hour shifts of oil men. And what was their job? Their job was simply to walk around the machine constantly, put a little oil here, put a little oil there, put a little oil someplace else. No young person today, no kid can even relate to the idea. What were they doing? What was their job? And then you explain to them that an active machine with a lot of interworking parts has to work in harmony. And without someone constantly tweaking the system and putting in the right amount of oil at the right time so that the parts continue to turn one another, but without too much friction, without generating too much heat, that's the only way something can continue to work harmoniously to do its job. And if it overheats, if one part of the machine starts rubbing the wrong way, it disintegrates and it stops doing what it's supposed to do. And this is a sense that I want to talk about with harmony. If you think about it, God created a world of harmony. We have all these cycles of nature, things work. We need to think about the oil man and the job of constantly maintaining a sense of harmony and completion and wholeness. And what does it take to do that? And I think if we latch onto this notion of what shalom means, of what shleimut means, what it means to integrate so many different elements that God has created into a whole that can produce what it's supposed to do and generate good and life and everything that it's meant to generate, then we can begin to look at the dominoes and the integrity of this week's Torah reading in a very, very meaningful way. So we're going to take this idea that something can maximally function harmoniously, provided that it is attended to. And the title of this class is Peace and Its Intruders. What are the elements, the common, ordinary forces that push things off track, that makes things not work together? And I think that if we look at this week's Torah reading in this regard, we will see the common theme and the integrity of the Torah portion itself. So let's go back and look at these elements here. We look at the Levites themselves, the families of Levi. They were the leaders. They, as I said, they're the center circle of the Jewish people, was the Mishkan itself, the dwelling place of God, where offerings to God were offered. Immediately around were the Levites, the families of Levi and the Kohanim. They were the leaders. And obviously, if they couldn't organize themselves in peace, and if they didn't have clear descriptions of how they could work together, you're responsible for this element of the Mishkan, you're responsible for that element of the Mishkan, that these three sub-tribes or families within the tribe of Levi, they needed to be given a clear mandate, and then they needed to stay within their lane for it to function. And we all know, if we look ahead in the Torah, what happens. Korach, one of the prominent leaders within this family of leaders, starts to usurp his role within the Jewish people. And right away, a rebellion ensues, and the whole fundamentals of Torah and Judaism called into question. So what do we see here? We see here the necessity of people having a vision of a community, of harmony, the vision, to stay with our analogy, of the oil man who stays up all night listening to the humming of the cylinders and sees the production level of that's coming out of this complicated machinery, and understands right now there's friction over here that needs to be addressed. There's a lack of harmony over here. This area of life is overheating. This area of life, this is what is part and parcel of maintaining peace, shalom. It's not just that nobody's killing one another. It's not just that we're not in the midst of a terrible strife, but it requires each person to maintain that perspective in that sense. And certainly as the leaders set that example, and we know that strife starts or seems to originate amongst leaders to such a great extent. We look at the headlines in the world today. So therefore, what's set up at the beginning was how can the Levium each function in harmony with one another and set the perfect example for the whole corpus of the Jewish people, for the whole camp of the Jewish people, to be able to operate bishleimut, bishalom, so that that together we see to it that God's name is sanctified in the world, that we are a light unto the nations. And it requires the sense of an understanding of roles and an understanding of place and an understanding that what it means to be role models and what it means to be leaders who feel the burden of leadership, but are not looking to disrupt the harmony and the sense of organization that's taking place. Let's now go back. That's the first part. Let's go back to number 2, the sota, the wayward wife. What happens in this situation? What happens, and there's technicalities here, but we're just going to look at the general sense. A husband and wife are living happily together. They're forming a family. And then there becomes, as the Torah describes, a sense of jealousy, a sense of suspicion, a sense of concern. And the husband actually takes action and warns his wife, you may not seclude yourself with this man. He causes suspicion on my part. And the woman does that. So then we come forward and we need to repair the situation. There needs to be a sense of, so to speak, relieving what otherwise would be a cloud over this family. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't continue to be married. We know, according to Jewish law, that if there really is infidelity, that the couple has to separate and that they can't continue living together as husband and wife. But beyond that, there's a sense of somehow this suspicion has to be rectified. And here the Torah does something shocking. The Torah says we take a parchment and we write down a portion of the Torah which contains God's name. And we're willing to take that portion and we dissolve the ink from that into the water in a very specific way. But God is willing to have God's own name erased in order to re-achieve a sense of equilibrium, in order to preserve and protect and restore the shalom bayit, the loving connection between a husband and wife. And that's the kind of esteem we're looking at. That's what it takes for a community to function. It's leaders who know what their purpose is and who act respectfully and harmoniously with one another. And it's also individual couples and families learning to, as things arise between them, how to deal with them, how to cope with them, how to take action necessary to resolve these concerns so that there's not just an absence of fighting or separation, but there's even a sense of real connection, of shleimut, of restoring a wholeness to the family. And that's where this section of the Torah stands out as the commitment to feeling that the shalom bayis, the harmony between a husband and wife, is so, so important. And we know by tradition, looking at Pirkei Avot, that Aaron, the high priest who was involved in entering the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, spent a tremendous amount of his time making peace between husband and wife, circulating amongst the Jewish people, repairing relationships, overcoming things that come up. And I think a great application of this that was mentioned to me was the sense of Lashon Hara. You know, there's always negativity being bandied about, and negativity is parallel to suspicion. But when it comes to suspicion, once suspicion invades a relationship, it's almost impossible to repair. And in an amazing source that I heard Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg quote from the Zohar, a mystical source, we know right after the splitting of the sea, just days after the Jewish people left Egypt, they traveled for 3 days and they came to a place where the water was bitter and they could not drink it. And they complained to God, and Moshe rectified the situation and the water became sweet to them. Remarkably, on a Kabbalistic dimension of understanding the Torah, God understood that the Jewish people had spent 210 years enslaved in Egypt, where the menfolk were forced to go out and do their work hours and hours every day oppressively. And in those kind of conditions, it's common, in order to really mentally torture your slave as well as to oppress them physically, to intimate the idea that, oh, you think these are your children, they're really my children. You think that you have a family, you have nothing. And over the years, perhaps in some of the families, a sense of suspicion had arisen. And hence God brought the entire Jewish people 3 days after being uplifted by the sea. And he brought them to a place where the water was bitter, and they only had bitter water to drink, and they all drank it. And on a certain dimension, God was saying, you see, this bitter water that you have drunk has had no lasting effect on you. Put aside your suspicions, put aside all of the oppressive comments and remarks that you were subjected to while you were in Egypt, and know that you're a sanctified people. Know that your wife is your wife, and your husband is your husband, and your children are your children, and restore a sense of integrity and a true sense of harmony and shalom in the fullest sense of the word amongst the Jewish people. That's what God was out to accomplish. And that's what that little side chapter in the Torah adds to this dimension. So it's very easy for us in our everyday lives to fall victim to all the negativity. There's no hope for children, confused time, all the obvious difficulties that people face on a physical level, on a spiritual level, on an emotional level, all the proneness to addiction and substance abuse that we're teaching our children how to avoid the best way we possibly can, the voids of meaning that people feel. A person needs to understand that you need to have an oil can for this as well. And in your own daily life, as things arise, a person has to have a way of quieting their inner selves, creating a sense of inner harmony, making sure that their relationships with those that they're closest to are intact and are not being disrupted. And now we come to the third element, which is the Nazir. Who is the Nazir? Who is this individual who has, surrounded by 613 Torah commandments and is living within the Jewish people, says, it's not enough. I need to verbally declare myself a Nazir and add specific restrictions, additional restrictions onto myself for 30 days. You can do it for a little longer, but typically it was for 30 days. Then I'll have to bring an offering afterwards. Where does this come from? So again, it comes from a sense of a person internally here, feeling as though my shalom, my integrity, my ehrlichkeit is a Yiddish word they use, my wholeness as a person is somehow not intact. Maybe I'm not mastering what I look at and where my imagination runs. I need a certain sense of, if I aspire to grow, if I aspire to become more than I am today, if I aspire to not live a life of pulls and pushes, which are so distracting and undermining and burn all the energy within me. So then I need to sanctify myself. I need to have this internal oil can. I need to realize the fact that there's a couple of aspects of myself that are rubbing each other the wrong way, that are creating tensions in a way that are not so healthy and not so good, and they're going to undermine me as a person. So the Torah again says, Shalom, God can offer you peace, harmony, and be an integrated human being. You can manage yourself. And here there's something really amazing. There's an amazing nuance here in the text itself, and we can look at it. But a Nazir uses his mouth to declare himself or herself a Nazir. And those words actually redefine their reality, so that wine now becomes a biblical prohibition for this man or woman who accepted upon themselves being a Nazir, whereas a minute ago it wasn't. It changes their reality. And here's the way the Torah talks about it. Isha isha ki yafli lindor neder. By taking a vow of abstinence. The word yafli, pela, it means wonderment. It means something that, a wonderment is two opposite things that coexist within each other. We say after we use the bathroom, we have a bracha, Veicho Basor, blessed are you Hashem, who heals people, who keeps our system running healthfully, who mafli la'asos, and does so wondrously. And what's the wonderment? The wonderment is that I, who possess a soul which is purely spiritual, which comes from on high, also have a physical, animalistic, smelly, waste-producing factory going on inside of myself, and those two coexist, and that supports my health and well-being, and it enables me to continue having a relationship as a living, breathing human being with God. So here's the rub. When a Nazir speaks and says this, what the Nazir is really doing is the Nazir is pronouncing and taking a stand and changing their reality. And they're doing it in a way by expressing themselves with that human ability to speak, which can create reality, which can recreate reality. And the wonder here is that a person using this level of internal commitment can take charge of their life and can find a new direction for themselves and can, so to speak, place the salving oil in the very joints that are needed so that smooth, harmonious, integrated functioning can continue afterwards. And that's the wonderment here. And actually, if you look at the 6th chapter, sentence 13, which is on page 760, 761 in the Stone Chumash, it says, at the end of the time, on the day of his abstinence is completed, he shall bring himself to the entrance of the tent of meeting, which in Hebrew is Yavi Oto El Pesach, which almost sounds like a third party bringing him, but it's really himself bringing him. And here again, the Torah is giving us the secret that we can use our speech to muster internal commitment, to take ourselves, so to speak, and to bring ourselves to a new place. We can commit ourselves to this type of growth, and we can see, we can redirect our lives, we can circumscribe, we can again find our place. Let's move on to the fifth. The fourth component is the Birchat Kohanim, which is this concept of Shalom, which we're now giving in an overarching way. And the fifth is the Nisim. And the wonderment of the Nisim is the offerings, the dedication offerings of the Nisim, which go on and on and on and on with the exact same offering. So as Rabbi Breitowitz points out, the Torah never wastes a word. It easily could have written, this is what each of the Nisim brought, and it could have done it once, and it would have saved us pages and pages and pages in the book of Numbers, and it would have reduced it from 176 verses to about 100. So why does the Torah not do that? So there's a lesson here. The hero of this story, according to Rabbi Breitowitz, is that Yisachar, the second of the Nisim to bring the offering, when he saw the first offering that was brought by Nachshon ben Aminadav, the prince from the tribe of Yehuda, he said, this is a perfect offering. It makes so much sense. I don't need to one-up him. I don't need to do something different. What I need to do is take what he brought and do it with my own spiritual commitment. And by not showing off, not distinguishing myself, but again, taking a big picture look at what's best for the community, what makes the most sense here. And he had no shame and no embarrassment to say, I can take exactly what was brought on the first day and I can add a qualitative, personal kavana, intent, understanding of it, and bring that, and that's going to uplift the community. And then each of the successive tribes did exactly the same thing. Each one internalized how they could become elevated and elevate their entire families through the same mechanism in the same way. Again, building a sense of true harmony and peacefulness in the world. And Rabbi Breitowitz really tells two stories in his talk. Number one, he tells the story about George Washington, that when he was elected president, he was first offered to be king. And he said, no, that's not what we've been fighting for. We want a different system of government. We don't want a monarchy. We don't want a tyranny. We'll have a president. And then after he was president for 2 terms of 4 years each, he said, that's it. And again, there was no constitutional amendment. The fact is that no president until Roosevelt ever went more than 2 terms. There was an understanding that that was a normative time for a person to be a leader, and then to turn over the reins of leadership, even though it wasn't bound by law to do so, but to see the good of the community and the good of the real sense of purpose in accepting the role of president and then relinquishing it in a reasonable time, so to avoid any sense of tyranny and self-aggrandizement. And in a different vein, he mentions a story that once the Panovich, who was famous and flamboyant, flew from Israel to Chicago to raise funds for his yeshiva, and he noticed another quieter rabbi had come to town exactly the same time as him to raise money for another yeshiva. And he knew that his stature and his oratory would push aside any opportunity for the other one to raise money. So he did something shocking. He gave up. He stood up. He gave his talk. He inspired the community. And then unbelievably, at the end of his talk, he says, I want you to know that all the funds you want to donate now, everything you have in mind to give to help the Panovich Yeshiva that I am the head of, instead, we're going to allocate it to this other rabbi, to his yeshiva, much more so than he ever would have imagined he could have raised. He said, why? Because the goal is to support Torah learning and Torah education. That's what the goal is. And if that's the goal, there's the yeshiva I run, there's the yeshiva he runs, there are other yeshivas. We should purely stay focused on what the purpose of our charitable donation is, and that's to increase Torah learning, to increase Torah knowledge. It's not one yeshiva versus the other, and therefore I want you to give what you're giving, and I want to give it all to this rabbi to benefit his yeshiva, and I'll carry on. I'll go to the next city, and I'll raise money, and slowly but surely I'll make up the gap. But that's the big picture. That's the sense of having shalom, of reminding people that there has to constantly be someone whose ear, each of us has to have an ear tuned to how well is the whole community running. Do I hear a tweak? Do I hear a grind? Is there a need for me to take that oil can? Whether that oil can is in the form of reminding myself what my lane is, whether that oil can is in the area of repairing the most intimate, close relationships to see to it that they're wholesome and they're not tainted and they're not clouded. Whether it's the opportunity just to look within myself and say, I'm getting off base. I'm becoming subject to too much internal conflict, and I need therefore to elevate my game. Whether it's the idea of saying, I don't need to stand out here. I don't need to be the person everybody's looking at. I can follow the footsteps of others because I realize and understand, and looking at the big picture, that it's together as a functioning community and as a functioning Jewish people that we can best influence the world and we can best achieve what we're out to do. So Parshat Nasso becomes an amazing symphony of what it means to achieve shalom, peace, and an understanding of these intruders, these natural areas of friction that are going to arise, and how we can have that spiritual oil can ready to see to it that we, the Jewish people, stay on track and we remind ourselves and we remain the full-fledged force for good that can only take place when there is shalom amongst us, when we are enjoying the gift of peace and harmony, just like they do in the heavens above. Thank you.
So, thank you, Rabbi. A quick question/comment.
Sure.
When you talked about the sota, you brought up the incident of coming to the bitter waters and how Moses made those bitter waters sweet. And I thought I'd never noticed the connection, but the waters that the sota drink are also called bitter waters that cause a curse. So can you remind me, what was the context in which you brought up the bitter waters that were made sweet by Moses with?
Because what the Zohar introduces is a notion that it would have been common amongst the Jewish people in each of their families for there to be an element of doubt and uncertainty about the purity of their family line. You know, I'm a 65-year-old person. For the first 64 years of my life, I was a slave in Egypt and I was working in the field and I was building pyramids or whatever I was doing there. And my wife was at home and the taskmasters ruled over us. And can I really be sure that my marriage is intact and that these children that are with me are my children? So God evoked a sense, and that's the only way, because the spelling of the words are different. In Exodus, and it's chapter 15, sentence 23, they were described as bitter waters, merorim, without an aleph. Here, they're described as mayim me'orarim with an aleph, like cursed waters, because they're waters that dissolve the words of a curse, which when drunk, because this is what God intended them to happen, they would cause a reaction in a guilty party only and would cause that person to die. So it's very homiletical. It's not the kind of connection that I would ever make, but you can understand that the Torah's interest in having harmony and peace within each family and between the leaders and the followers, so to speak, and amongst all the Jewish people sharing a vision, a unified vision of what accomplishment is, you can see how precious it is. And therefore, the bitter waters are not just they happened upon a place where there were bitter waters, but the bitter waters, after tasting them and then realizing that we all emerged from the experience of drinking these bitter waters intact, would remove any trace of suspicion that would have spilled over from the negative experience of having been enslaved in Egypt.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, and we should have a good